On July 3rd, something big happened. The US debt shot up by 410 billion in just 2 days. Why? Because the debt ceiling was raised. And this wasn't just a small lift. The US Treasury ended its so-called extraordinary measures and opened the floodgates, raising the ceiling by a jaw-dropping $5 trillion. This isn't just a financial update. This is the largest fiscal crisis in modern US history. Let's rewind. Back in January 2025, the US hit its legal debt limit 36.1 trillion. To avoid defaulting on payments, the Treasury used what it calls extraordinary measures, basically tricks to delay bills and stretch the budget without borrowing more. But that was just Band-Aid. Last week, President Trump signed what he called the Big Beautiful Bill, officially lifting the debt ceiling to 41.1 trillion. So why the sudden 410 billion jump? Here's the deal. Once the ceiling was raised, the Treasury had to refill the TGA. That's like the government's checking account. They also had to settle delayed payments and reverse temporary financial freezes. All of this had been paused during the crisis. Now, it all came crashing back instantly. Now, let's take a step back. In 2020, total US debt was 23.2 trillion. Today, we're headed toward 41.1 trillion. That's 17.9 trillion increase in just 5 years. Or to make it real, a 77% jump. That's not a glitch. That's not inflation. That's unchecked borrowing on a massive scale. And here is the scary part. We are not slowing down. In May alone, the US ran a 316 billion budget deficit, the third largest ever. So far, this fiscal year, we have already hit 1.37 trillion in deficits, and there are months to go. Over the past year, the US borrowed about 1.9 trillion. That's 158 billion every month. If we stay on that path, we will hit the new 41.1 trillion limit in just 28 months. That's barely 2 years. Another crisis is already on the calendar. And guess what? This is not a surprise anymore. It becomes a biennial tradition. A debt ceiling crisis every 2 years. Look at the timeline. October 21, crisis. June 23, crisis. July 25, here we go again. Each time we borrow more and faster. Each time we raise the ceiling sooner. It's a cycle and it's speeding up. Now let's talk about the budget deficit, because that's where it all starts. Over the past 5 years, the average US budget deficit has been 9% of GDP. And in the last 12 months alone, 7% of GDP. That is worse than what we saw in 2001, worse than the 1980s recession. Last year, the US government spent 7.1 trillion. That is 24% of the entire US economy. Let that sink in. Almost a quarter of GDP gone. And this much spending has consequences. Every time we borrow more, investors worry, so they demand higher returns. That's why the 10-year Treasury yield has surged above 4.1% repeatedly this year. Bond prices are falling, yields are rising, and markets are bracing for the next storm. And let's break it down with one painful stat. In 2024, the US spent 1.2 trillion on interest payments alone. That's more than we spent on defense, 855 billion. Medicaid, 618 billion. Veterans program, 412 billion. Interest is now one of America's biggest bills, and it's only going up. At this pace, we could see 2 trillion in interest with just a few years. And here's the punchline. 18% of all US federal revenue now goes just to pay interest. 18%. That's as bad as 1991, and by 2025 it could hit 22%. To compare, in the 2008 crisis, it was just 10%. And yet, despite all this, the Fed still talks about a soft landing. It's like watching someone drive off a cliff while saying, "Don't worry, I got this." So, my final thoughts. Here's the truth. We can't tax our way out of this. We cannot raise revenue fast enough to keep up with exploding spending. There's only one way forward. We have to cut spending. Because if we don't, the next crisis won't just be about numbers. It will be about consequences. Alright everyone, I just wanted to warn you all about this coming financial crisis that is arriving quick. Nvidia is just topping $4 trillion in valuation. The markets are insane at the moment. So stay safe out there and don't overinvest your money. Thanks for watching. Superior V2. Bye.